So I pulled out my revolver and shot out a couple of tyres, and that slowed him down, but he kept going.
Welcome to the final episode of I Spy. I'm crime reporter Natalie O'Brien, and this podcast is about the mysterious and often dangerous world of private eyes.
He had a lawyer working for him, a female lawyer, and she was sitting on the beach one day and he fired an arrow and shot her in the neck.
In this episode, we talk again with Keith Schafferius, Australia's most experienced private investigator.
So I put a couple of girls on the highway to hitchhike. Both of them were exponents of karate, very, very capable of rendering someone useless, and they were both licensed to carry guns, hoping that the guy picking up and raping and killing the hitchhikers would stop.
Keith has been a licensed private eye for more than 50 years, and he is a member of the World Association of Private Detectives. You will hear about some of his wildest cases, chasing fugitives, following a trail of missing planes and yachts, meeting with world leaders in the strangest of circumstances, and even being accused of murder. In his long career, Keith has taken on a range of different identities to both infiltrate and gain the trust of his targets. It might sound like fun pretending to be somebody else, but the reality is that undercover work is fraught with danger because you never know when your cover is blown.
And one of the guys said, "Oh, there's a mole in the camp. I think someone's dobbing on us." And, of course, I packed up within an hour and took off back to Brisbane before they could have realised it was me.
But before we delve deeper into that, there is another case that Keith will never forget, a case which started with a stolen boat but quickly took a dramatic twist.
This guy came to see me. He was of Irish origin, Irish nationality, and he set up to try and make some big dollars with stealing or claiming insurance on a boat, a fairly large boat, 36-foot boat that had been on a large trailer, and he stole a four-wheel drive vehicle and also a camper van and came to Queensland. He was wanted by police, and his partner in business had dobbed him in. So he came to my office one morning and sat in my office and asked me to help him find this boat. He said the trailer is parked in Queensland somewhere near a boat ramp, near a river. And when he described the trailer to me, I realised I knew the exact trailer and where it was parked. It was beside the Caboolture River, between Caboolture and Bribie Island, and that's where I used to go crabbing and fishing, and the trailer was in a yard there. So I spoke to the owner of the trailer yard, and he described the guy who brought it in, and the guy who came in each month to pay a bit of storage on it. And it turned out it was the Irish guy who came to my office, because he claimed it was stolen. And the day he was in my office is the day his business associate was murdered back down where in Fort Macquarie or somewhere like that, or it could have been Sydney. And he used the visit to my office as an alibi. So he said he was in my office that day. And several weeks later, the police raided my office, police from Sydney. There would have been at least a dozen police came into my office. And, of course, I didn't know what it was about. But when they told me, I cooperated with them. And they first accused me of assisting him regarding the murder and trying to cover up for him. Also, he had a lawyer working for him, a female lawyer, and she was sitting on the beach one day and he fired an arrow and shot her in the neck, and she became paraplegic as a result of that. So he spent some time in jail, and in fact the boat he claimed that was stolen, he was claiming insurance on, was in a boat that had sunk over near Fiji somewhere, and it was lying on the bottom of the ocean. He didn't have it. It wasn't his boat, but he knew about it, and he used the description of it to try and make an insurance claim. The camper van he had was stolen, and when the police did a thorough search of that, they found the revolver hidden up underneath was the one that was used to shoot his associate when he knocked on the door of the house and shot him at point blank. His partner, de facto partner, came to my office one day and was asking me about it and about the file. I got the file out and laid it on my desk. I went to get something else, and I didn't realise she had stolen the file while I was out of my office, and the file disappeared. So I couldn't, when I went to get the file for the police, I realised it was gone, and that's what must have happened with it. And because the police took my diary, and I always kept my diaries. I would have had 52 years of diaries, except for the one the Sydney detectives took and have not returned it to me. I think they lost it. So the diaries tell a lot of stories.
While some cases are solved rather quickly, others take longer to crack. In his longest case, Keith and a US bounty hunter were involved in a 30-year chase for one of the most wanted fraudsters in the Western world.
That's Michael Baghdadi Assad, a private investigator from Florida, and myself have tracked him for about 30 years through various frauds and prisons. He was actually born in Syria, and Syria won't take him back or won't take anyone. Claims he was born in Egypt and had Egyptian documentation, but we proved that to be wrong. He had American documentation and passports. He seemed to be able to get passports wherever he went, and we tracked him with 5 different sets of documents. Now, while he was on remand in Australia for the most recent fraud, we kept an eye on him, and had he gone back to the US, there was $1 million bounty on him, and my associate in Florida was a registered bounty hunter, and if we could have got him in the US, we would have picked up that $1 million. But would you believe we got pictures of him in the United States when he was on remand in Australia? So obviously there was another set of documents he used to leave Australia and then come back. He's now in his early 80s, but even when he was in prison in the US for a lengthy period of time, he conned one of the prisoners who was serving life for drug offences, had a house that they never found. It was in another name, and Assad offered to do the house up so it could be sold. Well, Assad did the house up and sold it for himself and took the money, the $1.5 million, and shot through, left a wife behind in the US with a young daughter. He just disappeared overnight out of the US, and the authorities were after him, so he would just pack up and go and leave, maybe get back in contact, and it was through her that she was looking for him, and then when it was realised there was $1 million bounty on it, my associate, being a bounty hunter, decided to take up the case and has worked on it for 30-odd years. We did have sold movie rights to the story, but the producer passed away last year, so currently we're looking for another producer to take up the story.
Back in the 1970s, Keith was part of a rather bizarre sting where he hatched a plan to catch a crook who was extorting large sums of money from fast food stores.
Yeah, that goes back to the 1970s, where the then fast food outlet Big Rooster, which is now Red Rooster, I think, or is it the other way around? The fellow was being extorted by this union guy who claimed that he was employing the wrong ratio of juniors to seniors in his organisation in Queensland, and but he could help. For a few dollars he wouldn't dob him in or change it around, and he could keep doing that and employing more juniors and seniors. The owner of the organisation came to see me, and when I checked it out, he in fact had the correct ratio, but this union guy, who was aged well into his 60s, was retiring fairly soon, and he said he would keep working for him and some of the other fast food chains. I believe it was McDonald's at the time, and would be just getting the monthly payment. So I recorded a number of telephone conversations with the union guy, and eventually we went to the police with the information we had, and the sting we set up was the owner of the chicken outlet was to pay him. He asked for $10,000 up front, which was a lot of money back in the 1970s. So we had the police involved. They commandeered a couple of home units across the road from the car park where we were going to pay him, and we emptied the $10,000 onto the bonnet of a car, and when the union guy was picking it up and counting it in, he was surrounded by police and charged, and ended up, the magistrate said he would have given him at least 8 years, but because of his age and his stupidity, he served 2 years in prison. And the owner of the chicken food outlet, was able to continue. One of the things I was most questioned about in court, and I've many times given evidence on cases I've completed, was about recording of the telephone conversation. Now, it was unlawful, as it still is, to attach any apparatus to a telephone line to record the conversation, and you should put a beep down the line every so many seconds, and I forget how often that is, but I was questioned, and I said I didn't attach it to the telephone. I held it a minute distance away from the phone to record, and I was questioned by the defence, what's a minute distance? And I held up a piece of paper, and I said the thickness of that piece of paper, that's how far it was off. So wasn't questioned much about the catching of him, the recording, or the information that I had put together.
It is interesting because Queensland has different laws about taping conversations than other states, and we've been seeing that in recent cases.
Yes. The other law in Queensland too is using GPS tracking devices on cars. Now, Queensland is the only state where there's no law, where we can, instead of following anyone physically or with another car, we can just throw a tracker up underneath the car with a couple of magnets on and follow the tracker. And when the car gets to where we want to know about the premises, the business or whatever, we can just go there. So it saves a lot of effort, a lot of time, and it's much easier.
Keith has taken on many undercover operations. It's not a mission for the faint-hearted. You have to keep your cool under pressure, but you also need to know when to cut and run for your life. In another nerve-wracking case, Keith was asked to find out how and where fuel was being stolen.
That was for a construction company where their fuel tanker would pick up fuel from the fuel supplier and go around to the various sites and fill up the machinery, and there was fuel disappearing there, mainly diesel fuel, and they employed me as the driver, made a position available, and I drove for 6 or 7 weeks, and once some of the people got to know me, they would also have their own vehicles lined up to be filled up with diesel, or go, one guy wanted me to go to his farm and fill his tractors with diesel, and I soon got to know where, how much, and how often the diesel was being taken. And then the same company employed me undercover at a construction site up near Townsville, and that was Teese Brothers at the time, who I did a lot of work for. They were constructing the new rail line from Greenvale into Townsville, and I had to apply for a position there. It couldn't be created, so it took me a couple of weeks going every day to the employment office out at outside of Townsville. And I think they got sick of me, and one day they said, there's a job for you towards Greenvale. You'll be a driller's offsider in the mountains there where we're drilling to lay the tracks. So I went out there, pretty hard yakka for someone who's not been used to that, and worked out there for about 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, and guys were stealing like tyres for earth-moving equipment, some of those big tyres, a set of tracks for a bulldozer, and as well as a big excavator disappeared. Well, that excavator was hidden in a valley and covered by trees, so as the contract finished, they could go back and take it. And one night I was at the bar, and those shifts were 12 hours a day and 8 hours on a Sunday, so it was pretty hard yakka, and I got well paid. They were talking about the theft, and one of the guys said, "Oh, there's a mole in the camp. I think someone's dobbing on us." And, of course, I packed up within an hour and took off back to Brisbane before they could have realised it was me or disappeared me, dug a hole and dropped me in.
Tell me, in some of your preparation work or looking for clues, has there been the sorts of things you sometimes see in the movies, going through people's rubbish bins and looking for details?
There has been, and one really large one that comes to mind is the case for the Swedish guy that we went to the Philippines for. The mother had shredded a lot of documentation and thrown it out. We pulled it all out of the rubbish and had someone sit for days and days just putting that shredded information back together, and ended up getting information that was pertinent to our investigation. And many other times we've looked in rubbish bins, wheelie bins to get information. Just a couple of years ago, a mother who was abusing her children and drinking too much claimed she wasn't, but we had record or surveillance of her calling into the bottle shop almost every afternoon, and then we would go and take the empty bottles out of her rubbish bin the next day, and that was used as evidence against her for the father who was trying to get access to his children.
Keith was licensed to carry a gun, and he has had to use it to save his life.
A semi-trailer that had been missing for some time and was wanted by a finance company where there's a lot of finance owing on it, and it took some time to find it. I found it one evening parked near some premises, and I confronted the guy and said we were going to take it. He jumped into it and took off, and his wife followed him in a car, and I started following him, and he wouldn't pull over, so he stopped and then started reversing fairly fast towards me. So I pulled out my revolver and shot out a couple of tyres, and that slowed him down, but he kept going. And I was onto the police, and he went out into some of the back streets outside of Brisbane, and he went across a narrow bridge, and his wife in her car stopped in the middle of the bridge to cut me off. And would you believe it, the police had just turned up from the opposite direction, and they were able to pull him over in the semi-trailer and arrested him for being unlicensed driving, unregistered vehicle, and so forth. And he said I shot at him, so they confiscated my revolver and took it back to the police station. And next morning, having contacts in the police force, I was called by a policeman and said, "Oh, your revolver's here. You better come and get it. We checked it, and it hasn't been fired in the last week." You'd have to be licensed to carry a gun, and I'm not licensed now. I handed the gun in, and yes, I always had a couple of guns.
And then there was the case that stuck with Keith for the rest of his life, a case where he almost cracked it. Gabrielle Janke and Michelle Riley were assaulted and murdered while hitchhiking to the Gold Coast.
Gabby's body was found dumped in Ormeau. She was 19. Michelle, just 16. Her remains discovered over a week later south of Logan Village. A massive police investigation uncovering few leads. Despite the risks, hitchhiking was a hallmark of the 70s.
5 more girls were killed in what became known as the Hitchhiker Murders. Appalled by the crimes, Keith and his undercover team tried to help catch the killer.
Well, it was in those days where most of our work was of a night time, chasing husbands and wives for adultery. So in the daytime had plenty of time. So I put a couple of girls on the highway to hitchhike. Both of them were exponents of karate, very, very capable of rendering someone useless, and they were both licensed to carry guns, hoping that the guy picking up and raping and killing the hitchhikers would stop. Well, the car, we believe to be the car, twice went up the road past one of the girls, stopped, turned around and started to follow. But two other cars stopped to give her a ride, and she refused a ride. So the guy, instead of continuing, went away because he thought if he came up and asked her to hop in, she'd refuse him too. And that happened on 2 occasions. So we almost caught that hitchhiker murderer, I believe, who has never been caught.
Keith has also had his share of fun cases, such as one time where he had to chase a missing private jet and a passenger boat.
I had a case from a large firm of accountants in Europe who had a large bankruptcy on their hands for a guy and a company that went bankrupt. And some of the assets were missing, and he wouldn't say where they were. Now, those assets were a small passenger boat that carried about 80 passengers and 2 Learjets where he transported passengers. Now, they contacted me and asked could I help. They said there's no money in kitty, but they would pay me for any out-of-pocket expenses. If I could find the equipment, I agreed on 10% of the sale price of the recovery. And they thought the little ship was operating off Tasmania or New Zealand because it was equipped to go to the Antarctic. I couldn't find it there, but I made some inquiries and found that it could have been operating from Ushuaia in Tierra del Fuego, just in the southern tip of South America. And again, they agreed to pay my expenses to go over there and have a look. So I flew over through Argentina and down to Tierra del Fuego, to Ushuaia, and showed a couple of pictures, and the people there said, yep, it comes in here every 4 or 5 weeks and picks up passengers and goes on to the Falkland Islands. So I booked to pick up 10 passengers at Port Stanley on the Falkland Islands, and the day the passengers were to be picked up, I had organised for bailiffs and pilots and ship's captains from England, Great Britain, to be there because the Falkland Islands are British territory, and they came down and seized the ship and the aircraft, and it took about 4 years to sell it all up. But while I was in Ushuaia, and as I do, I get to meet a lot of people, make friends. I befriended this Argentinian Air Force general who was down there, and he said to me, Keith, tomorrow we're going down to service our military base at Marambio down on the Antarctic. Do you want to come down for a ride and have lunch with us? Now, Marambio is about 1,300 kilometres south of Ushuaia, and I took the opportunity and had to be ready at about 3 a.m, so we flew down in the big military aircraft, landed on the ice down there, had lunch at the food hall, the mess, and it was about 2 p.m. when the flight captain came in and said, everybody out and rush to the aircraft, the sky is falling. And what he meant by that, it was a whiteout and everything, it's such heavy fog you can't see, and we had to be off the ground before that happened. So, but did have lunch there, sitting up on top of the ice, and could see the icebergs floating by, and it's a place where the average person would never get to, so I was very lucky.
Keith's more unusual missions have seen him meet world leaders in the strangest of circumstances.
I was working for the finance company Australian Guarantee Corporation at the time, where they were looking for 2 fairly large yachts that a manufacturer on the Gold Coast who went broke had disappeared, and the yachts had disappeared. So they asked me could I find them, and I made a lot of inquiries, and I found they had been loaded onto a cargo ship in Brisbane and taken to the US, to Texas, and then down to Florida. So they instructed me to try and find them. I'll find the guy and go and see him. So I found the guy. He was living in a penthouse in West Palm Beach, Florida. I flew over there to interview him, and during the interview he asked me had I ever heard of Donald Trump. I said, well, I have. I've read a book about him. And he said, well, he owns this unit and he's coming here this afternoon. If you wait, you'll get to meet him. So I waited, and young Donald turned up, and that was in 1997 or 1998. And Don was quite a young guy at that stage, and got to meet him and spent about 2.5 hours with him. And the 2.5 hours was Donald Trump talking about himself, his money, his girls, and so forth. I didn't get much time to talk to him because he's so full of himself at the time, which I believe he still is, and just praised himself up for his money and the women he had.
And speaking of world leaders, in a rather unexpected situation, Keith met the wife of another prominent figure.
I paid a bribe of $100,000 to a person in the Philippines to locate the little boy, and we flew in a military helicopter at no cost over the compound to see if we could see the little child, but we never ever got him out, and he grew up in the Philippines and went back to his father as a teenager back into Sweden. Interesting little turnabout there. Imelda Marcos used to have breakfast at the Intercon Hotel every morning where I was staying, and she would fly over there in her helicopter, or whatever helicopter it was, land on the roof and come down for breakfast. I had breakfast with Imelda probably 12 or 15 times during my stay there, and I found her to be a lovely lady.
That's interesting, with great shoes on every day, I'm sure.
Well, that was my next comment. She had different shoes on every day.
And tell me, I'm just going to ask you, what are some of the tools of your trade?
Recorders, vehicle trackers, common sense. I guess common sense is one of the most important tools I have, to use my brain and just do what has to be done. And helicopters, yeah, I've used a military helicopter free of charge in the Philippines, but a couple of times in Brisbane when we've had to follow vehicles who knew they were being followed, I just chartered a helicopter and followed them from in the air, and they certainly took evasive action, driving across the highway into suburbs, back out to the highway again, but eventually followed them. And people forget to look up into the air when they think they're being followed. So twice that happened with the helicopters being used for surveillance.
So all sorts of things as well, like guns, cars and boats?
Guns only was used once or twice, but I never relied on guns. And I always thought most times I wouldn't carry a gun because, how should I say it, violence invites violence. If you pull a gun and someone else has got a gun, well, they're going to pull it out too. And it gets back to who pulls the trigger the fastest.
So what does a day in the life of Keith, the PI, look like?
Every day can be different. Every case is different. The outcomes are different, although they're successful. Over the weekend, and I'm still busy. I get more work than I can handle. Over the weekend, I had 3 new cases come in. 2 of them were from Canada. One is just to locate a beneficiary to an estate. The other is to locate the brother and mother of a person who left Australia 25 years ago and has lost contact. So they come to me, they find me on the internet. I'm on Wikipedia. since about October last year. So I'm fairly easy found if they look for a private investigator in Australia or look for me by name or private detective. They usually come up with my details. And about 6 weeks ago, I received a call from a guy from Estonia. His father was murdered in 2016 and murdered by his brother, who was a former police officer and who went around to his house and shot him 14 times. The murderer, the ex-police officer, was charged, got away with second-degree murder and only served 25 days in prison. Now, the son, who was my client, came back from the United States. They had very successfully set up in the United States in mining and exploration, and he found me on the internet and asked, is there any way I could help? And I'd only used it once before, but stored satellite imaging. I was able to make contact with some people in the United States in the Secret Service who were able to access the stored imagery for 2016, and it wasn't video back then, it was still shots every so many seconds, and it zooms in, would you believe, sufficiently close to what would be about 3 metres. We were able to identify motor vehicles on the ground and where the motor vehicle was parked, and also the person coming out of the house out onto the road. It was daytime, it was a clear day, and the satellite was at the right angle. So a private witness said there was no altercation between the two. Of course, the murderer said there was an altercation and he shot his brother in self-defence, but you could see the guy come out of the house, or a person come out, walk towards the street, and all of a sudden he's lying on the ground. There was no contact or altercation took place. And as a result of that, putting that out on our International World Association of Detectives website, I was contacted by some other members wanting to know how I did it, who I used, as they had some cases too. One guy from Texas was investigating an arson, a house fire, where they believed someone had lit the fire and left the house. So I put him in contact with the satellite storage people, imagery storage. And there was another guy who was an investigator working on a disappearance of a girl that there was about 2.5 hours that they couldn't fill in. So he also was making contact with the satellite people. Now, I don't understand why the police don't use it, but it was explained to me if the police started using that, they would have to employ 1,000 extra people to be going through all that imagery. But because I'm known, trusted, and I have the contacts in the right areas, I was able to do that. And when I put out the request on the website, I had 3 responses, one from a friend in the US, and that's the one I used, one from Israel and one from India, but they just wanted too much money for it, sort of under the table money. So I used the one out of the US from Secret Service.
That was the final episode of I Spy, a podcast about the mysterious and often dangerous world of private eyes. You've heard from our real-life Magnum PIs and Miss Marples, who are out there solving one exciting case after another. If you've ever wondered if your partner is cheating, wanted to find someone, or suspected someone of fraud, you now know who to call. Australia's fast-talking, quick-thinking gumshoes with a nose for trouble, who'll stop at nothing to crack the case. Thank you to my guests for sharing your amazing stories throughout the 8 episodes, and thanks for listening.